I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Charles Michel, President of the European Council of the European Union, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a mural adorns the wall of the Security Council chamber. The Norwegian painter Per Trog painted a phoenix there. It's a phoenix that emerges from a world covered with ash that is being rebuilt after the war. The lower part of the mural is dark. It features a dragon. It features soldiers and war machines. The United Nations were founded to protect us from our demons. It was founded to elevate the world community towards peace, cooperation, and solidarity. And yet the climate crisis is wreaking havoc. The global effort to combat poverty is weakening, and this war of Russia against Ukraine is exacerbating food insecurity and creating an energy crisis. And finally, we are losing our sense of urgency that the pandemic had taught us. The progress is too slow. We are losing ground in many places. Ladies and gentlemen, the mantra of the Indian presidency of the G20 was one earth, one family, one future. And indeed, we are a universal family, and the United Nations should be the backbone. And as Secretary General said, this family is, however, dysfunctional. The European Union wants a world that is multipolar, that is cooperating and progressing towards more democracy, towards more respect of human rights. And yet, confidence is eroding, tension is increasing, and a dangerous bipolar confrontation is threatening us. It's as if we had to choose one side against the other. It's a little bit like the frenetic race to arm ourselves with nuclear weapons in the last century. Artificial intelligence now, especially in the military arena, has become that of geopolitical competition. And yet it was said by our very much missed Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, wisely put it, the United Nations were not created in order to bring us to paradise, but rather to save us from hell. Ladies and gentlemen, lucidity imposes this. The United Nations system is today sclerotic and hobbled by hostile forces. We must assume our responsibility, and that means being engaged in order to put multilateral cooperation back on solid ground. And to that end, what we need is to first restore trust, solve the most urgent problems, and repair the United Nations system. First, restoring confidence. Trust and confidence, as we know, are based on respecting the sacred principles etched in the United Nations Charter, respecting sovereignty, territorial integrity, and human rights. And yet, for the last 19 months, a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, without any shame, has been undertaking a war to conquer its neighboring country, which never threatened it in the past, and is therefore sweeping away without shame the fundamental principle. And this brings with it its share of horror and disdain for human life. The General Assembly has on a number of occasions condemned the resumption of the war of Russia against Ukraine, which is, of course, a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty to which we are so attached. And this means we need to stop the Kremlin in its deadly adventure. But it has not been even slowed in its feeling of impunity. Impunity, as we know, cannot be eternal, and the time for justice will come. The European Union will unwaveringly support Ukraine in its right to legitimate defense. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we know so well that the European Union also knows that this war against Ukraine will not make the other many and major challenges that the world must confront, will not make them disappear. The planet is boiling. The world is torn asunder by poverty and injustice. And we know there will be no miracle if we do not decide to mobilize the massive financing that's necessary now. For example, we have undertaken a collective commitment to limit heating of the planet to 1.5 degrees. And yet we know that we are far from reaching that goal. And heating of our planet will achieve 2.5 degrees between now and the end of the century. We must get back on track. The European Union has raised its goals for energy usage, which is renewable, and energy effectiveness. We have seen this with the G20, and we hope that more members of the international community will commit to this end. It is also in the interest of all countries to build the capacity of developing nations to be able to commit towards carbon neutrality between now and 2050. We see that only a fourth of world private investment is taking place in developing countries, and yet it is the G20 countries that are responsible for 80% of global emissions. And it's only this year only, that the international community will be reaching that promise of some years ago, the bar of $100 billion to finance action for climate. The European Union has been a driving force behind this, with $26 billion in 21 already invested, which is more than our share. We must do more. The International Energy Agency believes that world investments for energy transitions need to reach $5 trillion by 2030. That's 4% of GDP worldwide. And it needs to be maintained at that level to achieve zero carbon for 2050. And that's why in Dubai, we must put in place the financing for funds for loss and damage decided last year in Shanghai, Czech. We must do so at COP28. And finally, the natural disasters are coming one after another at a heady speed. It's all continents and all of our countries, and we saw this most recently in Libya. And that's why putting in place an international disaster fund is more necessary than ever in order to ensure swift and equitable response and to build our collective resilience. Prevention is also key. Hence, the efforts that we support in the United Nations in the context of the Sendai Path and Framework to manage disasters. And likewise, ladies and gentlemen, trade is powerful. It's a powerful tool to bring together climate challenges and prosperity. And that's why we call for urgent solutions to the mechanism for settlement of disputes in the World Trade Organization. Ladies and gentlemen, the economic and financial situation of vulnerable economies has been gravely affected. They were seriously affected by the COVID-19 crisis and the war between Russia and Ukraine. More than 50 low-income countries have defaulted on their debt, and another dozen might follow suit soon. And this is especially due to servicing the debt that replaces expenditures for social protection, education, health care. Due to that, 165 million people around the world have been swept into poverty. No one should have to choose between poverty reduction and greening the economy. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow ourselves the luxury of one more debate about the increase here. It's not about begging, it's about justice. What we're talking about here is a global financial system that's more robust and more fair and better prepared for the 21st century. Earmarking $100 million for special drawing rights is an important stage in this development, and we must do more. Of course, we support the stimulus of sustainable development goals presented by the Secretary General, and the European Union is fully committed to implement the common framework of the G20 for debt action. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have to go beyond, go even further. The Bretton Woods system needs to be reformed, and it must be done so deeply. It needs to be more equitable. It needs to be more inclusive and more effective. That should be the goal. These institutions were created when many countries were still colonial. And since then, the world has changed. It has changed so much. And yet today, the G7 countries still have almost absolute decision-making power. The European Union is prepared to better share this decision-making power. And regions that almost have no voice need, in our view, to be better involved in the decision-making that concerns them. Second, financial shock is necessary. Entire swaths of the world and peoples that are represented are deprived of access to financing, and this impedes progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and it also increases the possibility of a debt crisis. The Paris Summit led the debate to discuss a new worldwide financial compact convened by the French president, along with Barbados and the Prime Minister of Barbados. We've set the path, and as Mia Mottley said, it is now a question of speed and scope and breadth. We must do what's necessary, and we need to do it in time and for the right reasons. Indeed, we need to act to better mobilize capital, public capital, and act to increase and consolidate and tighten the financial flows which are key for lending capacity of international institutions.
For example, in 60 years, the financing power of the World Bank as a proportion of global production fell sevenfold. And that speaks volumes. We must also reduce the cost of access to loans for vulnerable countries, which often is far higher than that for developed countries. Lastly, we must adapt the rules of multilateral development banks when it comes to capital requirements that will allow for a flexible use of their balance sheets without jeopardizing their soundness. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, 3 years ago, Dr. Tedros and I launched the idea of an international treaty on pandemics. And together, we committed to try to persuade the international community to launch negotiations within the WHO. The world needs an ambitious and legally binding instrument to prevent, prepare for, and respond to future pandemics with solidarity. I now call on all of you to amplify your efforts to conclude negotiations by 2024. And we will be a constructive and open partner in this. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, the Secretary General and all of the UN teams are the linchpin of strong action for humanity and the values of the UN Charter. But as we've seen, UN governance is far too often and increasingly impeded. The EU, of course, supports the reform proposals presented by Secretary General in our common agenda. We also commend the progress made in terms of working methods. Today, we would like to go even further and to present a new perspective to the necessary and urgent debate on UN reform, as well as 3 proposals on voting rights, on representation, and on the role it should be played by multilateral organizations. On these 3 topics, I call for amending the UN Charter. First of all, veto rights in their current form are being abused. They lead the Council to be paralyzed. A permanent member of the Security Council can violate with impunity and flagrantly our charter and international law. It can even abuse its veto right to prevent sanctions against itself. It can even exploit the Security Council to disseminate propaganda and disinformation, as well as lies, let's be honest. The Charter, however, says that Security Council members must abstain from a vote when it itself is the object of that vote. So I now would like to call on Council members to invoke this provision when Russia is concerned. Lastly, in the same vein, the EU supports the French-Mexican initiative to limit veto rights in the case of mass atrocities. We also support the Code of Conduct for the Council's action against genocides, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And lastly, we support all efforts to bolster transparency and accountability within the Security Council. But beyond this, when it comes to reforming the UN Charter, I think we must establish a mechanism that would combine majority-based decision-making with a moderate and well-controlled, flexible use of the veto right. My second point is representation. The Security Council does not reflect today's world. Currently, 60 countries have never had a seat in the Security Council. Entire swaths of the world, Africa, South America, the Caribbean, Asia, are under or non-represented. We support a comprehensive reform of the Security Council to amplify the voice of these regions and countries. Power and legitimacy go hand in hand. And due to its lack of representativeness, the Security Council is inexorably damaging its own legitimacy. Legitimacy is crucial and must be strengthened on two fronts. The UN is a club of nations, and we believe the nation is its basic unit. Therefore, an increased number of permanent Security Council members is inevitable. But we believe, my second point, is that we should go further than this. Regional and continental organizations today play a growing role. That is a fact. The EU, of course, as well as the African Union, the community, Latin American community, ASEAN, these all reflect a new level of legitimacy in international and multilateral fora. These organizations play an effective role in political and economic coordination, and they create spaces for cooperation, closer cooperation, as well as collective action. They also play an increasing role in security. And even more than before, they are also regulatory spaces. That is true of European integration. This example we see has inspired many others, such as the African Union, which is striving to establish a large free trade zone on the continent, or ASEAN as well, which works for coordination between its member states. These organizations have a growing influence in the multilateral arena, and they are crucial contributors toward stability. I believe that their role must increase in the multilateral system because they are helping to build the multipolar world that we all wish to see. And that is why, through me, the European Union immediately supported the call of Senegal's President Macky Sall to include the AU as a full-fledged member of G20, which has been the case, was done a few weeks ago. Ladies and gentlemen, as you see, I am deeply convinced the UN would gain legitimacy and effectiveness as well as authority, if it were to choose to guarantee the inclusion of regional organizations. And this inclusion would create a virtuous circle. It would encourage these organizations to cooperate further and better in order to further strengthen their own stability and that of the world. And in this context, I plan to initiate or to propose an institutional summit between the EU, the AU, CELAC, ASEAN, and of course the UNSG, who will be invited. The goal, as you can see, would be to reflect on how these organizations can act together to strengthen the multilateral system in the case of the UN as well as other international entities. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude the EU through our history and our DNA would like to be a comprehensive, loyal, faithful partner. We in the member states are the largest donor for development and peacekeeping throughout the world, including in regions where conflicts have become deeply entrenched. In the Sahel, a series of military coups d'etats have increased instability and insecurity to the detriment of local populations. And here I would like to send a message of personal friendship and tireless support to the president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum, who's been imprisoned 56 days in his own home by a military junta. in the Middle East. We believe that lasting peace is only possible if Palestinians and Israelis can live together in security through a two-state solution. And in the South Caucasus, the latest devastating developments have shocked us. Military force is never a long-term solution if we want to win over hearts and minds. And throughout the world, the EU continues to shoulder its responsibility together with all those who work toward the common good for peace and prosperity. But we will never be intimidated by violence or threats. Distinguished colleagues, Per Krog's mural is an act of imagination. It also is a reminder for our consciences. A crucial reminder today, because today more than ever, we are in a world confronted by many dangers. Philosopher Friedrich Hölderlin said, and rightly so, where there is danger, there also is the power to save. In the face of these dangers, we have a vision of a better world, a brighter world. And we have powerful tools. I believe deeply in the power of collective intelligence. It's our turn to act now. We must act now for a more just, free, and prosperous world. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the European Council of the European Union for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency.